So I'm John Ward. I'm an enterprise agile coach. I'm currently working in a tier 1 bank, and I am globally leading the rollout of lean portfolio management across 6,000 people, 650 teams, and the budgets are north of $1.5 billion that we're using. So, you know, it's big bucks, big time, big stuff. I'm a disciplined agilist. I'm a disciplined agile scrum master, senior scrum master, and value stream consultant instructor. I'm a safe SBC and so on. I'm one of Qatar's global experts on Agile, and I'm also a member of the Agile Business Consortium and the Agile Alliance. I've produced 2 books. One was the Agile Coaches Cookbook, and the other one is an Agile Lineout. So I'm really interested in non-software Agile. I'm looking at how do we use Agile in things like marketing, how do we use Agile in things like HR, and how do we use Agile in things like transformation. So this is a real interest of mine. I've just come back literally this time last week. I was in Boston in the USA delivering a paper on Agile leadership to a conference with a load of Harvard professors and guy from MIT and Wisconsin and universities. And I was one of only, out of the 20 odd speakers, I was one of, you know, there were only 6 of us which were actual practitioners, which was it was great. We thoroughly enjoyed it, but very intimidating at sometimes. So let's talk about Agile leadership and Agile transformations. Just to say that this is relevant, and the materials that I've got in here would be relevant to the ICP ENT and ICP CAT certifications, which are provided by the Leadership Tribe, just to make sure that you can see the link up between what I'm presenting and what Leadership Tribe do. First of all, let's talk about transformation. And in transformation, to transform means to change completely. Typically, Agile is never the objective. Agile is always the means to achieve the objective. So let me give you an example of that. In a recent assignment, we were looking at customer satisfaction, and the goal of the transformation was to improve customer satisfaction, and we used Agile to deliver that. In another area, the time taken to implement, it was in telecoms, a broadband service, was 4 weeks. But when we actually did the work analysis was about 5 days, and we used value stream analysis and agile teams in order to achieve that. So Agile typically is not the end result. So Agile typically is the enabler. And the next thing to say to you is that cultural change is not easy. Culture is something that we've all grown up with. Senior leaders have all got to their positions because of certain ways of behaving, certain processes, certain techniques, and so on. And therefore, what we're doing when we start to implement Agile and we start to talk about how to leadership changes in order to enable self-managed teams to perform, that cultural change is not easy, and particularly in the middle layer of the organization. So typically what happens is at the top of the firm, people say we want to be agile. They may or may not understand what that means, but nevertheless they get committed to it. At the bottom of the shop, people, and I don't like this term, but you know, the people who are doing the work, they actually get agile and they love it. It's the middle layer, that transformational layer that takes strategy and converts it into things to do. That layer is the one where we hit most of the problems. And that's why it becomes very difficult. When you're starting to look at Agile, therefore, and starting to look at transformation, the key is to understand what we're trying to achieve. And so therefore, what I do is I use objectives and key results, OKRs, in order to define that. And a bit later on in this presentation, I'll give you some examples of that. And then we're going to talk about horizon-based plans. So why are we using horizon-based plans? Typically because sponsors want to know what they are going to see at certain points in time. The whole concept of we can't tell you because we're agile falls down with a transformation, because they might be spending thousands, if not millions of pounds, and they may have significant interruption to their operations. And senior execs always want to know what's going to happen by when. Last thing to say is Scrum doesn't work with transformation or business change. And the reason for that is because the time box approach is too short for cultural change activities, and also because the level of empirical control and definition of done doesn't necessarily work. So what you've got to do is to much more using the Kanban approach to understand how things are flowing and whether we're moving things across the board. Last, we've got some misconceptions. Simply getting teams to implement Scrum is not transformation. That's just Scrum implementation. So when we're starting to talk about really developing teams, getting the organization to change, then it's a bigger issue. Next thing to say is cultural change can't be trained. Can it, or can it not? Well, cultural change actually is, culture is the result, according to Ed Shine, of processes, behaviors, and so on. That can be trained, but actually changing the culture is about people taking that insight and actually changing their behavior. So cultural change itself is the indirect result of training rather than a direct result. And then lastly, transformation doesn't just involve software teams. What I find is the biggest issue around transformation is it's the teams or the people around the team which need to change. So basic knowledge of how we're operating, where we're going to operate, where we're changing, needs to be communicated so that the people who have to change their culture understand the wisdom of what we're doing. And it's very key that we do that. So we're going to talk about Agile is never the objective. Cultural change isn't easy. What do we do about it? We're going to talk about OKRs, plans, and so on. So Agile is never the objective. So strategy enabler, new products needed, better customer service, faster time to market, value stream optimization. Those are all objectives that Agile will help organizations achieve. Let me give you an example. In a recent assignment, we found a fintech was taking away market share because they were faster to deliver and they were also cheaper. So what we did was implement Agile in the development teams. In our particular, I was in a software house at the time. We reduced the average time to market from 48 weeks down to less than 20. And we reduced the number of man days involved or person days involved from about 620 down to about 200. So got some of them down to 160, but on average about 200. So this gave the organization the strategic goal that they were looking for. And once they got that, they could actually then start to think about other things. So the consequence is that we don't need to use SAFe or Scrum perfectly. I've got a friend who we call Pareto, and Pareto says you do 20% of the effort in order to achieve 80% of the benefit. Now, I'm a firm believer in Pareto. You get quite a lot of people involved in, oh, we're going to implement Agile, and they try and implement exactly straight out the book what SAFe or Scrum says, and they forget that the objective is not to do SAFe or Scrum properly, but it's actually to enable the strategy. So quite often the fact that the team, the team's not 10 people but 15 Does it matter? Can Scrum still work in that environment? The answer is, of course, yes, but it doesn't mean that we've got a perfect Scrum. If you use SAFe, for example, they're talking about PI planning, but when you find that some of the teams have an unstable backlog, in other words, things come into the backlog which need to be reacted to, does that matter? Does that help? Does that give the problems to the team? Does that mean we're not using SAFe? And the answer is we can do SAFe-like stuff, we can do Scrum-like stuff, as long as we're enabling the strategy. So talking about definition to transform is about changing completely. And that means when we're doing this type of work, we're talking about leadership, we're talking about processes, we're talking about organization, we're talking about outcomes. And the result of that is that we're talking about culture. So we are changing the nature of an organization. So if you read John Kotter's book, Accelerate, John Kotter's book says that we are trying to change the hierarchical organization is by its nature very slow to change. And he recommends that we mix a blend of hierarchical organization and network aligned organization, which is what we talk about as an organization aligned to a value stream. That organization is much easier to adapt because they're closer to the customer, because they are talking about end-to-end journeys and so on. So that would change the leadership, it would change the processes, it would change the organization, and naturally it would change the outcomes that the organization is working with. So when we get to transformation, we have to be very clear about what it is that we're trying to change, what it is that we're trying to transform. So cultural change is not easy. It's not achieved directly through organizational change. It's achieved through organizational processes. It's around behavioral change. It's around the actual organizational structure itself. In making those changes, a coach influences the culture, but you can't go, oh, we've done a training course on agile mindset, therefore everybody is now agile. That doesn't work. So, well, you probably need to do the training, but what you need to do is then think about how does the change in behavior manifest itself, and what are you going to measure, or what are you going to observe in order to evaluate whether you've actually achieved the goals that you set yourself. The consequence of this is that change is unpredictable. So, and this is again why Scrum doesn't necessarily work. So if you think about a definition of done in Scrum in software projects, you can say, okay, we've defined this user story, we've developed it, we've tested, we've got working tested software, and therefore we can tick the box and say that's done. If you're saying that we want to try and change the way in which a senior leader deals with his teams, and you've done training, you can see, you can observe the gentleman or the lady on 6 weeks, in a 6-week period, and 9 times out of 10 they're probably behaving in, let's call it, an agile way. But then all sorts of things may change if that individual goes under stress or the organization becomes under duress, and what you can find is things that you think you've changed can regress very quickly. So the consequence is that the changes that you think you are making in a transformation are not that permanent, and you need to make sure you try and measure the data about what is actually happening. So let me give you an example. Progression metrics is about the outcome. So you remember I said to you, one of the teams I work with was looking at improving customer satisfaction in a telecoms company, right? So we measured customer satisfaction, we got a net promoter score of a number, and then when we deployed our next solution, about 2 months after we deployed the new solution, or a partial solution, we measured it again. If the progression metrics showed the NPS going up, then fine, we knew that we were getting somewhere closer to our goal. If, on the other hand, the progression metrics so that we'd regressed, we would need actually to change our strategy and pivot accordingly. So those progression metrics in terms of business change and cultural change are an essential part of knowing whether you're going to get there or not. So let's talk about those progression metrics, and the way in which you can start to think about that from the outset is to use something called outcomes and key results. So here is a set of outcomes, excuse me, that I've brought as an example. The first one is the ability to respond to markets faster. So we would look at increase the agility. So what we're doing is using, what I use is quarterly planning. So quarterly planning in a transformation is not too long a window, but it's also not too short. So you can actually look and see some measurable improvement in the organization. So what we're going to do is to increase agility in the organization during Q4. And how do we know we've got there? Well, we're going to know we got there because we've got a reduction in average time to release solutions, and we've got a reduction in deliverable cycle time from whatever the beginning time was to the result. So that gives us a measurable that we can look at, and we can say, are we achieving the goal that we wanted to do in order to get faster time to market? We can look at that improved satisfaction score. So the NPS score is to build on Q3, and we're talking about moving it from X to Y, or Y to X as I've got there. There could be lower weight states in the retail value stream. That could be that we're trying to look at the amount of work that we have, weight states and work states. So what this could be, trying to improve the time to ship items to customers, and we can actually measure that in terms of wait times. We could also measure that in terms of defects or error handling type items, and we can also reduce it by initiative cycle time. So what we've got is a set of OKRs, which we can then say, okay, if we're going to reduce the average time for release solutions, if we're going to reduce the deliverable cycle time, how are we going to do that? What tasks are we going to take? What tasks are we going to put in the plan in order to achieve those sort of goals? Okay. And what I've found where it really works is the following. Here is something which I'll call an agile sundial. What you find in a transformation is you end up with some themes. And in this particular sundial that I've got here, I've got 4 themes. The first one is organization. Second one is teaming and finances. Third one is building the capabilities. And then we've got ways of working. Those were the themes that we've developed from those OKRs that we had on the previous slide. Then what we do is actually say, okay, what are we going to achieve in the next 30 days? So you can see on the building the capabilities tranche of this sundial, you can see it says evaluate the feedback from the agility survey. And you can see we can have ongoing communities of practice, and we've got communications and training happening in order to build those capabilities. So we've got tasks and we've got long-term activities happening. And we can look at that and say, so we can go to senior management and say, this is what we plan to achieve in the next 30 days. Now, you've got on the right-hand side, you've got 30, 60, 90 days. I would describe in each one of those boxes what the, if you like, what the testing criteria would be, what the horizon would be. So maybe the first one would be establishing benchmarks and getting ready, or mobilization. The next one might start to go collecting data for improvements, and then the following one could be whatever it is. This gives us the ability to actually talk to senior management about what is actually happening in the transformation. It also gives us a tool to talk to the organization to say, this is what we're doing. This is also a tool that we can use for employee communications and so on. The key is the right-hand segment, measuring the outcomes. What we definitely need to do in any agile transformation, indeed in any transformation, is to make sure that we have metrics which show the progress. So you can see the first one there, first item, activity, is agree metrics to show progress. Okay, and always you get somebody after 2-3 months saying, how is it going? And if you've got the metrics, you can start to answer the question. But if you don't have the metrics from the beginning, from the outset, then that will stop you answering that question, and you won't be sure about what the direction you're taking and how that actually is proceeding. Mike Kottmeyer talks about planning using expeditions and base camps, and this is an essential concept, right? If you think about expeditions, what we do, and that's one of the North Pole expeditions, I think it's Sigmundson or whatever his name is, basically we do an expedition to reach our objectives. So that expedition could encounter problems on the way. You might have to deviate because of crevasses or cliffs or whatever. This gives you the path to a certain goal, and we say, okay, here's the certain goal that we're going to achieve. Now, Agile transformations, just like Agile software, uses incremental delivery. So you're not seeking to go from A to Z in one step. You're needing to take steps on the way. Intermediate steps was the word I was looking for. So we're creating an expedition to our first intermediate step. That in that situation, we now get there. So that's after our 30 or 60 days. We've got to something which we call a base camp. Now, what you'll find is with cultural change and with transformation, that base camp, establishing that base camp means that what you might have to do is not do further work to move forward, but further work to consolidate where you've got to. And in some instances, you might need to go back and refix. So for example, behavior around, I don't know, maybe we're talking about, we've aligned work with capacity, for example, in an agile team. And now all of a sudden, some senior managers said, I don't care, you just got to do it. And we might need to go back and change the way that things have happened. If you've got, some people, you've tried to put decision-making close to the customer, and you've tried to get that decision-making into a self-managed team, and then a middle manager suddenly steps in and says, I want to make those decisions. Or an internal auditor saying the wrong people are involved and we need to improve, I don't know, involve regulators or internal audit or whatever it is. And you might need to go back and refix things. So the concept of planning the pathway through to what we call the expedition to achieve a certain goal, which we call a base camp. Once you get to that base camp, then you may need to consolidate, and you may not be able to understand what the consolidation activities are until you actually get there and you take stock of what's actually happening. So this comes from Mike Kottmeyer, and I think I've used it many times, and I've proved that it really does help us understand what we're trying to achieve. And I think this is very much, in contrast with IT projects or software, that there's a degree of certainty around software delivery that simply doesn't exist when you're talking about organizational or people change. The last thing I'd say to you is I've found that Kanban works much better than Scrum. Why? Because Kanban allows us to do, you've got a backlog of things to do, you've got the doing things and you get the done things, right? You don't have to estimate Kanban. You can use WIP limits, work in progress limits. In other words, we might say that the maximum number of items in doing with our current team size is 6, right? And we can then say, okay, in order to move a new one from to do to doing is that we've got to complete something in the doing column. And that gives us the ability to make sure that we never overload our change team. But the other thing that happens is when you're doing cultural changes, in Kotter's 8 steps in leading change, he talks about mobilizing the volunteer army. Now, I did not appreciate how powerful this is until recent experience with British Telecom. So in British Telecom, what we did was we called for volunteers. We had a guiding coalition or a project team of about 12 people. We called for volunteers, and all of a sudden we had 50 people. Now, those 50 people need to know what they're going to do. They need to have tools. They need to have guidance. They need to have direction, and they need to have measured results. So in calling for volunteers, what it did was it moved the guiding coalition from a fairly relaxed state, oh, we can get that done next week, or it doesn't matter, it slipped a few days or whatever. All of a sudden, if you've got 50 people pushing you, you've got this momentum that you've really got to harness, and this army of people that you really need to engage. So what you can do then is, if you're using Kanban, 1 minute, sorry, I've got a call going through here. No, that's gone. So when you get that volunteer army together, then you can put more work onto that doing column, and you can start to see what's happening. And then you can get those people that are doing the work to actually update the Kanban so that you can actually see what's happening. And it's really a great tool set. And then what I do is I use the walk the board technique. Now, walking the board isn't using the same technique as Scrum. So technique of Scrum is, what are you doing today? What are we going to do tomorrow? And what are your blockers? What we do is instead is we look at those doings, and we actually talk through every one of those doings to say who's doing what on this, how is this working, what's happening, and so on. And especially when you get the volunteers involved, it gives them a great sense of what's happening in the overall transformation, just not their bit of it. And it's amazing when you start to do this, what you'll find is you get cross-fertilization of ideas. Okay, now the thing to say to you is that to-do list on the left-hand side, on a software project, that to-do list gets fairly fixed, okay, within the realms of Scrum and Agile and so on. But what happens when you're starting to use a volunteer army and you've got, 10 or 12 people involved in the guiding coalition, what happens is people come up with ideas in the walking the board activity or the daily review. And what they do is they actually say, well, instead of doing this, why don't we do that? Or have we tried this? Or I think we should do that. And that means that what we're doing is we're looking at in that to-do list, and people are creating new to-do items, and we are then prioritizing that and cleaning that backlog, so that what we're doing is actually making sure that the transformation is doing the right things in the right time, in the right sequence. And it's absolutely fabulous the way that Kanban helps you to do this. And obviously then some things may actually come out of the done list and go back into doing because of the cultural implications of the changes and so on. So what we've got here is the Kanban approach is much better for us than Scrum. You probably might have another column in there, I think, that I would suggest. One of the key things with transformation is communication, and I would suggest you might want a communications column to get some clarity about the communications plan, how the communication's working, and so on. And again, this is where the volunteer army comes in, because definition of communication is that I'm transmitting something and somebody is receiving it, and we need to get that two-way channel open. So when you find that you can put on the Kanban board that somebody's got a problem or didn't receive this communication, or one particular group is having difficulty with this communication, or whatever, it gives you a great visibility of what's happening on the the real transformational activities and where the rubber really hits the road. So the Kanban process itself is just, I think it's almost designed for transformational work. So that's the end of what I wanted to cover with you. I have produced a book, talked about Agile Lineout, which is a framework for non-tech teams, which talks through some of this theory that I've talked about, gives you practical examples. It's based on system theory. There's some lean in there, and there's some behavioral science in there. I've got a fabulous, there's a model that I discovered by a group called Dickinson and McIntyre, and it talks about team building, and it talks about the seven aspects of team building. Now, when you think of Scrum and so on, we know that the essence of Scrum and Agile is a team, getting a team to work together. But what happens is that it doesn't give you any guidance. But this framework from Dickinson and McIntyre really does help and provides us with some really good stuff that we can look at as coaches to see how the team's working and so on. Okay, Moritz, do you have experience in initiating Agile from a bottom-up approach? Yes, of course. Yes. Most Agile teams will look at starting out and getting teams using Agile, as particularly in the software space. But what I've found actually, when you're starting to look at transformational Agile, then you also need to do top-down and bottom-up, and that really gives you a huge benefit in terms of management to get involved very early, and they see the results, which may not be apparent when they're just working with single teams. So Moritz, if you want to come off mute, if you want to ask a further question, please just say so. No. How do we reduce time to market? A QA automation, CI/CD for quicker and safe deployments, training to the team. Yes, but Narinder, the other way to do that is to look at wait states and work states. So if you map your value stream out and then put a Kanban board across it, and then track and put one of the columns for each of the stages on your value stream, what you can then track is use the data from the team's JIRAs and then track how long things are taking between the various stages of the workflow. And that will give you data, excuse me, that gives you data that allows you to evaluate how long work is waiting before it gets actually actioned. So that gives you the ability to reduce time to market without looking at automation and CI/CD. It gives you time to market, reducing time to market by organizational design, and it really does work very quickly. So you can get the organizational design right and then look at automation, and then you can further reduce it, if you see what I mean. So I would suggest have a look at time to market. If you don't know how to do value stream mapping, reach out to me and I'll help you do it, and we can talk about how to do it very quickly. So that would be great, Narinder, I hope you've answered your questions. Next question is, how do you win over, engage, motivate volunteers? I haven't had a problem with motivating volunteers at all. All of the motivation is by example. So if teams start to see, or people start to see, that the transformation is having some good impacts, then people tend to want to join and get involved. So we ran in British Telecom, we ran what we call the Agile Fest days. And those Agile Fests, we got 2 or 3 teams to actually tell people what they'd achieved. And what we did was we put on this Agile Fest for half a day. We had like 15 presentations, at peak, we had about 1,000 in total unique visitors. There was about 1,500 people over the course of the day, but the maximum on one session was something like 400 people. But a huge amount of kudos got for the team, huge amount of kudos for the organization, and we didn't suffer with a lack of volunteers. In fact, we probably have more volunteers that we could reasonably use and employ. So Moritz, just let me know if that's your what your.
He's dropped in the chat box, John. He's replied to you saying that he agrees. Great point. That's what he's seen in his experience as well. Always.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Artie. Thank you. Guiding coalition, Sringash, is a concept that's in, if you look at John Cotter's book, Leading Change, which was effectively the master Bible for the master guide for change for many years, you'll find he describes a guiding coalition there. Now, a guiding coalition is a very interesting part of the organization because it's like a steering group, but it steers, right? But it's also made up of people from various different parts of the organization. And the important piece is it's also made up of people from different levels in the organization. And the reason why that's important is because the guiding coalition uses the networks of the individuals to actually affect the change. So our guiding coalition in British Telecom had people from network design, it had people from customer experience, it had people in there from network engineering, it had people in there from Agile itself. And basically the team worked together in order to first of all define what the OKRs were. We published the OKRs, we got stakeholders come and review the OKRs. So we did like a big room planning session where we identified the OKRs, we got all the stakeholders' feedback, and then set about creating our plan. And then we took our plan back to those stakeholders in order so that everybody understood what was planned and gave transparency. So the guiding coalition steers, but it's not a steering group. It does work. What you'll find is that you tend to have a leader in there, but any leader in Agile is a leader in name only. And so this was about, sharing the responsibilities and the accountabilities and so on. So that guiding coalition is an essential part. Artie would like to answer the question live. Okay. Was that to me, Artie?
No, sorry. So I moved them over to when they're completed as live. I moved them over. Sorry.
Okay, no worries.
There are a couple more questions.
Yeah, okay. I've got one from Andy. Hi, Andy. Thanks for the insights. What are your thoughts on Scrum Kanban hybrids? Can Scrum be redeemed for enterprise change by Kanbanizing Scrum? Yeah, I'm just starting to look at Scrum Ban. My issue with Scrum is you definitely want the plan, do, check, act cycle using Kanban, and you definitely want that as is an important part of transformation. My problem is that plan, do, check, act is great in a Scrum cycle. So you can say, I've got a 10-day time box for work. But when you're doing transformation change, you might do plan, do, but your check can't happen for 2 months or a month and a half away, right? Because of the nature of the changes that you've made. So you don't get the immediacy that you would want with Scrum to do the plan, do, check, act. And what you might do is you would put your one item on the do on your Kanban board, and you would put the check on the Kanban board, let's say in 6 weeks' time. So that gives you a much better granularity in terms of being able to affect the changes and so on. So I think this is that's what I would say. I'm just starting to evaluate I'm working with a tier 1 global bank, Scrum Ban in there. In fact, there was a call this afternoon about it and I missed it, but about how does Scrum Ban work and whether there's some advantages in doing that. The other thing I would say about Scrum is that you've got, the concept of sprint planning and loading the sprint to capacity and so on. It's difficult to estimate cultural change activities. So it's much better to pull them off the board and then use cycle time in order to evaluate what's happening and what's stuck and so on. So that's what I would suggest, Andy, if that's okay. Let me know if you want some more data about that. Maurice, back again. Hi, Maurice. What do you think are the major challenges for subject matter expert to realize an agile transformation? You know what? If an organization doesn't commit the resources to a transformation or isn't willing to take the time to learn, then the transformation is doomed to failure, right? Because people need to commit time to learn and to change their ways of working. Now, anybody who's done this type of work, what we're trying to do is, we typically don't have a brand new company and we say, right, we're going to change, we're going to design it to be agile. So what typically you do with a software shop anyway, is you want the software teams to continue to deliver while you're changing them. So it's a bit like, somebody said to me, it's a bit like changing the engines on a jet aircraft halfway over the Atlantic. So you've got to preserve their ability to deliver while you're changing them. And that means that you've got to be very careful about the risks that you invoke on the team. But Moritz, you're absolutely right. There's nothing that succeeds more than telling people about the success. So what we've done in the tier 1 bank is we've worked with some teams to get what I'll call exemplars that says, we've reduced the amount of time taken to deliver an XYZ from A to B. And then we said, well, that means you could do that on similar other types of projects. And we've used that to give, if you like, targets. And then we're looking at, okay, so if you're going to achieve that target, then you need to do some investment either in time or people or both, or tools even. And that gives us the ability to change, but it's always based on examples. So I love evidence-based management as a technique, and I'm not talking about the recent paper produced by Scrum. I think it's scrum.org or Scrum, but the one that, if you go into evidence-based management and look at it, the descriptions of about, around the year 2000, you'll find some really good practices in there, and I use that an awful lot. What are the key challenges you have faced while transforming and aligning business functions? I'll tell you what the biggest, Hariki, is a lot of people think they know what Agile is. And they think that they say, for example, oh, well, we can't be Agile because we're not co-located, or we can't be Agile because XYZ reason. And I find that those people are putting up the barriers a lot to why they can't change. Another key barrier is job families and professional qualifications. So if you look at finance, for example, they've got set ways of doing things, probably which goes back 100 years to McKinsey in the 1920s, when he defined how to do budgeting and variance management and all that stuff. And then if you start to use rolling forecasts and these sort of things, and the beyond budgeting piece, it steps professionals outside of their professional comfort zone, and it changes the way in which they operate. If we go to HR, for example, HR for long years has been saying, well, what we do is we set goals, we measure people against those goals, and we give them performance ratings. So now if we don't do goal setting and we look at, we're doing teams rather than individuals, and we look at the way in which we're managing people with like resources or machines, and we suddenly want to use them as artists or craftspeople, that challenges a lot of HR wisdom that's been in place over the last 50 years or so. So I find that some of the challenges against the status quo, the agreed way of working, and so on, those are quite fundamental in terms of the challenges that we face. Typically software engineers, because they've taken over the latest version of Java or the latest this, or they've gone onto the cloud, they've learned new technologies. Typically software engineers are very adaptable, and they're really not resistant to change at all. They're really adaptive. It's senior management that are resistant to change. They say they want to be agile, and then when they realize that they don't have their capacity management chart or whatever it is, they get very nervous, because some of the things they used to get successful in their career, they're no longer able to do, and that gives them big problems. Is that the last of the questions?
There is one question actually in the chat box by Smita, where she asks, how can we have companies invest more on innovation or IP sprints in SAFe? Sometimes they are cancelled due to critical deliverables.
Well, I think it's a question of there is always a gap between strategy and actually doing things, and if the organization doesn't realize that there's a burning platform, they simply won't invest in it. So nobody will do innovation for innovation's sake. They might develop a new, for example, if you think about the issues around the electric motor car, nobody really got onto the electric motor car bandwagon until Tesla produced their first vehicle. And then all of a sudden, all the old firms like GM and Renault and so on suddenly had to switch, because suddenly somebody had broken the myth that the only way a car could run was with a petrol engine. And this, I think, and then everybody then played catch up. So, and by that time, people will have lost market share and so on. I think Tesla is I think 70% of the vehicles in the UK, electric vehicles, are Teslas at the moment. I think that's probably it's somewhere around there anyway. And that's a burning platform for most vehicle manufacturers. And a lot of people then suddenly realize, oh, we've got to change. So BP moving from petrochemicals into electricity production and offshore electricity and so on is another example of a burning platform resulting in energy in innovation. Well, I'll leave you to your evening. Have a great session. Super comments. Thank you very much, everybody. Very humbled.